Seminoles had fled the rice plantations, built their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness, and then fought almost continuously for 50 years to preserve their freedom. It is little wonder they should provide some of the finest soldiers in the U.S. cavalry. While studying the then hidden story of Native American slavery, Florida anthropologist John Worth came to the conclusion that at least 600,000 indigenous people in southeastern North America had been abducted into slavery. Slave raiders typically only took with them young women and teenagers. The men, defending their families, were killed by European slave raiders. The native tribe slave raiders usually tortured and killed all men of military age, plus butchered the toddlers, who could not make the walk back to coastal slave markets. Thus, at least 600,000 Native Americans died as a result of slave raids. The big problem with Native American slaves, though, was that unless they were sold to plantations on Caribbean islands, they often found a way to escape back to Indian tribes within the interior. After King Charles II of England became personally involved in the African slave trade, African slaves became preferred by customers in the British colonies. Almost all of the British colonies, including Georgia after 1752 and Canada after 1763, but excluding Pennsylvania, legalized the slavery of Africans. Thus, the lives of African slaves and Native Americans had become interwoven. Books and newspaper articles were even published, then in the Carolinas, which promoted scientific breeding programs for mixing these two races to create ideal slaves. These documents are absolutely repugnant to modern eyes, because they present non-European humans as being no different than cattle or horses. Human slavery had only been a legally sanctioned institution in the North American colonies for 5 years, when the colony of Charlestown was founded in 1670. By 1710, 20% of South Carolina's population was Native American slaves, and 40% was African slaves. During this period, most African slaves had only a minimal knowledge of English. In their isolation on the coastal rice plantations, they had evolved a new language that is called Gullah today. It mixed the words of several African languages with words of the Creek Indians and English. Owners of African slaves, fresh off the ship in New York, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, had quickly discovered that many of these people died during the harsh North American winters. Over the eons, they had evolved bodies which thrived in the hot, humid tropical climate of West Africa, but were very vulnerable to cold temperatures. Those that happened to mate with indigenous American slaves produced offsprings, whose more muscular, heavy-boned physiques were much more tolerant to wintertime. The African slaves were only able to orient themselves to this strange new land by listening to the words of the Native American slaves. The indigenous and Mustie slaves told of a land to the south called La Florida, where slavery was now illegal. The boldest slaves found ways to escape their bondage. Some Africans accompanied their indigenous friends to native towns in the interior, but with that came the risk of being captured by English bounty hunters at any time. For slaves to obtain secure freedom meant a dangerous walk in bare feet of over 100 miles to the border of La Florida. Along the way were dangerous swamps filled with several species of poisonous snakes and alligators. Most of these freedom seekers were only dressed in rags and carried little or no food with them. As early as 1687, African slaves fled from the South Carolina Lowcountry to Spanish Florida seeking freedom. Despite Spain's despicable treatment of America's indigenous peoples in the 1500s, human slavery had now been banned. Under an edict from Philip the Fine of Spain in 1693, the black fugitives received liberty in exchange for converting to Catholicism and defending the Spanish settlers at St. Augustine for at least 4 years. However, most of the black militia was more than happy to be permanently allowed to kill English-speaking invaders. After the province of Georgia was colonized immediately north of La Florida in 1788, the Spanish organized the Africans into a militia led by a man named Francisco Menendez. He was a Mandingo from Africa who had escaped a South Carolina plantation in 1724 and rose to the rank of an officer under the flag of Spain. The African militia unit was based at Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, meaning Royal Thanks of St. Teresa of the town of Moses. It came to be known as Fort Mose. A formally planned settlement was founded around 1738. It was the first legally sanctioned free black town in North America. Contemporary sketches of the fortress suggest that it strongly resembled a fortified Mandingo village, with the addition of Spanish bastions on the corners. In 1740, Fort Mose was attacked by an English army from Georgia under General James Edward Oglethorpe. The occupants fled to Castillo de San Marcos, but the African militia returned in force to attack the English troops there, killing all but about 30 of them. The fort and settlement was rebuilt in 1752, but abandoned in 1763, when Spain and France lost the 7 Years' War, and Great Britain had gained ownership of Florida. However, in the long run down the 1800s, when the army captured the Black Seminoles at some point, the US government had refused to return them to slavery, fearing that these seasoned warriors, accustomed to their freedom, would turn the Seminole War into a widespread slave rebellion. That alliance ended in 1838, when the United States offered to recognize the freedom of the Black Seminoles and pay them money if they would lay down their arms and agree to move to the Indian Territory. Over 500 Black Seminoles took up the offer. Once in the West, many Black Seminoles adapted to the lifestyle of the plains. Most were already expert horsemen. Some became cowboys. Many Black Seminoles accepted an offer from Mexico to form a border patrol to combat Comanche and Apache raiders. In 1850, a group of Black Seminoles and Seminole Indians escaped south across Texas to the desert badlands of northern Mexico. They established a free settlement and, as in Florida, began to attract runaway slaves from across the border. In 1855, a heavily armed band of Texas Rangers rode into Mexico to destroy the Seminole settlement, but the blacks and Indians stopped them and forced them back into the US. The Indians soon returned to Oklahoma, but the Black Seminoles remained in Mexico, fighting constantly to protect their settlement from the marauding Comanche and Apache Indians. In 1870, after emancipation of the slaves in the United States, the US cavalry in southern Texas invited some of the Black Seminoles to return and join the army. Wildcat and John Horse, leaders among separate groups of Seminoles and Black Seminoles who were forced to accept reservation land in the Oklahoma Territory, moved to Texas, then across the Rio Grande to live in the mountains of Nacimiento in the Mexican state of Coahuila. The Mexican government, which banned slavery in the years before war between the Union and the Confederacy, allowed the Seminoles and Black Seminoles to stay and raise cattle and plant crops in return for providing warriors to patrol the Mexican border with Texas and create a line of defense from raids into Mexico from other tribes. These Black Seminoles would be called Mascogos, a name that comes from Muskogee, the language shared by many of the tribes of the Southeast. Mexican Civil War led to the Black Seminoles migrating back across the Rio Grande when slavery ended after the Civil War. The moves were encouraged by the US government, which wanted the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles to prevent raids into Texas. This was at the end of the Civil War. The Black Seminoles had been invited to return to the United States to serve in a special ops unit to combat hostile tribes and enforce martial law in the South during Reconstruction. Those that accepted were promised land and retirement pensions at the end of their service. This had motivated them greatly. They had believed the United States on their word and had taken up the deal, trusting as they can be, for good and survival. The US Army recruited Black Seminoles as scouts. This forerunner of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs quickly developed the reputation as the finest military unit in the West. It was soon expanded into being the Seminole Negro Scout Troop of the new 10th Cavalry Regiment. In 1875, 3 of the scouts won the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, in a single engagement with the Comanche Indians on the Pecos River. However, when it came time for them to retire, although the Black Seminoles became known as the best scouts in the best cavalry regiment in the West and won 4 medals of honor, not one of them ever did receive land or a pension thereafter. The US government officials said that it had lost the original treaty and had no record of them serving in the US Army. Like seriously? Even heirs of the Black Seminoles who became the famed Buffalo Soldiers of the Western frontier had to insist that the Army said they would be given their land in return for their military service. But no such documents ever did surface. In 1873, command of the Scouts was given to Lieutenant John Bullis, writes Katarina Vittich in a 2002 research paper. The Mascogos, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans. She continues, under Lieutenant Bullis, the Scouts would spend the next 10 years as a major force in the eradication of Indian and bandit depredations in that area of Texas. Every commander who worked with the Scouts praised them for their courage and their skills. and those who worked most closely with them were the most vehement in their protests at the abandonment and mistreatment of the Mascogos by the US government. The Scouts would win 4 Medals of Honor, an incredible statistic for their tiny numbers. They served valiantly in a number of capacities until they were disbanded in 1914, but the US government kept none of its promises to them. She adds, "At the height of the Indian Wars, when the Scouts were continuously in the field providing invaluable service to the US Army and the citizens of Texas, their families and community were starving because the government had cut off their rations and would give them no land or supplies for farming. Instead, some black Seminoles stole cattle to feed their families. Texas cattle ranchers sent hired gunmen to threaten or kill black Seminoles. When John Horse was shot and captured, Wildcat paid his ransom. With little hope of changes, many black Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande again to live in Mexico. The US Army had disbanded the remaining Black Scouts empty-handed in 1914. Even Medal of Honor winners? There was neither land nor pensions for any of these loyal-minded black Seminoles. This would mean that they were being tricked all along by the US into their bidding, their crafts, skills and strength exploited yet again, only to be left high and dry in the end. Yet another humiliating betrayal of the blacks this was, by the United States. In 1842, the Army forcibly removed them, along with their Indian comrades, to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in the unsettled West. The black Seminoles, exiled from their Florida strongholds, were forced to continue their struggle for freedom on the western frontier. In Oklahoma, the government put them under the authority of the Creek Indians, slave owners who tried to curb their freedom, and white slave traders came at night to kidnap their women and children. However, after all said and done, today, there are still small black Seminole communities scattered by war across North America and the West Indies. The Black Indians live on Andros Island in the Bahamas, where their ancestors escaped from Florida after the First Seminole War. The Seminole Freedmen, the largest group, live in rural Seminole County, Oklahoma, where they are still official members of the Seminole Indian Nation. The Mascogos dwell in the dusty desert town of Nacimiento in the state of Coahuila in northern Mexico. And finally, the Scouts live in Bracketville, Texas, outside the walls of the old fort, where their grandfathers served in the US cavalry. These groups have lost almost all contact with one another, but they have all retained the memory of their ancestors' gallant fight for freedom in the Florida wilderness. In 1978, Dr. Ian Hancock discovered that elders among the Texas Scouts still speak a dialect of Gullah, 140 years after their ancestors were exiled from Florida, and as much as 200 years after their early ancestors escaped from rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Both the Oklahoma and Texas groups, though deeply conscious of their Florida heritage, were unaware of their connection with the Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia. They did not know precisely where their slave ancestors had come from before fleeing into the Florida wilderness. The Oklahoma Seminole freedmen still possess a rich traditional culture combining both African and American Indian elements. They continue to eat rice as a characteristic part of their diet, sometimes applying a sauce of okra or spinach leaves, like the Gullah, and like their distant relatives in West Africa. In closing, it is said that in the year 1970, the Indian Claims Commission had awarded the Seminoles, of both Oklahoma and Florida, collectively, $12,347,500 for the land taken from them by the US military. This brings us to the end of yet another video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.